The reaction to the debacle of Shabbetai Tzvi, which I discussed with you last time, the false Messiah of 1653, the fact that he converted to Islam, and all the air went out of the balloon is the only way to really phrase it. It threw the entire Jewish world into a depression, because a false Messiah is much worse than no Messiah. And so there were various reactions. One reaction in the Jewish world was to hunt down the Sabbateans, to hunt down those who were his followers, because when it comes to Messianic movements, there always are true believers. And the true believers believe no matter what the facts are. And here, even after the death of Shabbetai, even after the conversion of Shabbetai Tzvi to Islam, not only even after the conversion, even after his death, there were those that still believed that he was the Messiah and still believed in him. And this spawned another messianic movement in Poland by a charlatan by the name of Jacob Frank, who also broadcast ideas of messianism, that he was the Messiah. And eventually he was such a charlatan that he convinced the church in Poland, a very strong Roman Catholic country, and the Polish church was always interested somehow in seeing that the Jews of Poland converted to Catholicism. And in fact, a non-Jew who would convert to Judaism was subject to being burned at the stake, as happened to a number of them. So the church was very interested, and he made them a proposal in which he said that he would be able to bring the Jews of Poland to the baptismal fount. And as a down payment, he and 300 of his followers converted to Christianity in the main cathedral. But the Jews, needless to say, did not follow him. And there began a very strong, almost a violent reaction against the Frankists, against the Sabbateans, against all of these messianic pretenders and their followers. Now, in Europe, there was a great Rav named Rabbi Tzvi Ashkenazi, the Chacham Tzvi. He was the Rav in Amsterdam in the 1600s, and he was instrumental, together with another great Rav of Amsterdam, Menashe ben Yisrael, in having Jews come back to live in England. The Jews have been expelled from England since the time of Richard the Lionhearted, the early 1200s. Small pockets of Sephardic Jews came and settled in London illegally. But because of the fact that England was then undergoing great change, it had undergone a revolution against the monarchy, and then the Restoration and all sorts of things. And it was the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment. So then the attitude towards Jews, though not good, began to soften. Now, Menashe ben Yisrael was born to a Marrano family, to a Converso family in Lisbon in Portugal. And in fact, he was baptized as a Christian. But when he was 8 years old, the family escaped Portugal and came to Holland. where many Spanish and Portuguese Jews came to after fleeing the Iberian Peninsula. And there they reverted back to Judaism. And he eventually became the Rav, Sephardic Rav at least, in Amsterdam. And he traveled to London and had discussions with Oliver Cromwell, who had led the rebellion against the Stuarts. And Cromwell agreed that the Jews should be allowed to come back to England. Now, Cromwell had his reasons also being religious reasons, because he felt that the Christian Messiah could not come if the Jews didn't exist in all the Christian countries. And therefore, by preventing Jews from living in England, he was, so to speak, postponing the advent of the Christian Messiah. And Menashe ben Yisrael used this argument in favor of the Jews. And so that beginning in the late 1600s and the early 1700s, there were already Jews that moved and settled in London. The oldest synagogue in London is the Bevis Marks congregation. It still functions today. It's almost 300 years old. It was a Sephardic congregation. And the fact that Jews now had the ability to come to England, even though they did not come in major numbers until the 19th century, but just the mere fact that they could come was like a shaft of light in a very dark room. The Chacham Tzvi, Rabbi Tzvi Ashkenazi, so he wrote a famous Sefer of Tshuvas, Chacham Tzvi, that was published in 1712. I happen to have a first edition copy in my library. When I was a Rav in Miami Beach, I guess it happened all over America. People would come after their father or their grandfather or someone, member of the family, passed away. So they would take all the Hebrew books, which they had no use for, and dump them on the door of the synagogue. And I would go through them. So I found this book, 1712, first edition of the Chacham Tzvi. I found a Maharsha from 1555. Found other things. So it's not that people threw out things that were valuable, like the book is worth, that was a Chacham Tzvi may be worth a few $100 for sure. Maharsha is worth a few $1,000s for sure to collectors. But the fact that you could, you just throw it out. But that's the story of the Jewish people to a certain extent in the last century. People not only threw out books, they threw out their heritage, they threw out their soul, they threw out themselves. Just dumped it. And then later it's hard to get it back. I remember I asked around who left the books, because I wanted to tell them, but no one ever confessed that they knew anything about it. It's a little like leaving a foundling on the doorstep, right? In Europe, the custom was that they would leave foundlings at the door of the rabbi. It was common. So if a woman had a child out of wedlock, or all sorts of things. So they would leave the child by the rabbi, and the rabbi would be responsible for somehow seeing the child got raised, etc. The one that was most noted for that was Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Chaim Brisker. So in Brisk, they used to have a famous saying. They used to say Reb Chaim's mamzerim, Reb Chaim's bastards, because he had a whole slew of kids that he was responsible for, and he raised them. So there was a time they left foundlings at the door. Today so in my time they left books at the door. They leave, which is easier and cheaper to handle. But it's pretty much the same idea of the abandonment of something. Anyway, so the Chacham Tzvi, we have a wonderful portrait of him hanging in the museum in London. The Balabatim in Amsterdam, the members of his congregation, wanted to have a portrait of him, and he would refuse to sit for it. But when he traveled to London to meet with the English, so they had hired a British artist to sketch him, unbeknownst to him, and from that he developed a full oil painting portrait, which I saw in London. I don't know if it's in the Tate Gallery or it's one of the other art galleries of the Chacham Tzvi. Now, the Chacham Tzvi had a child, a son. We're talking here early 1700s now, just past the Shabbetai Tzvi period. So it's still influenced. In fact, the shadow of Shabbetai Tzvi still hovers over the Jewish world. So he had a son, Rabbi Yaakov Emden. It was called Yavitz, Yaakov ben Tzvi, Yudai and Beis Tzadi. Rabbi Yaakov Emden was a great scholar. He was a very different person. He owned a printing press. He lived in what is today Hamburg. Today it's Germany. Then there was a triple Jewish community called Ahu, Aleph, Hey, Vov. The Aleph stood for Altoona, the Hey for Hamburg, the Vov for Wandsbek. Now, today it's all absorbed in the large German port city of Hamburg. But then Ahu belonged to Denmark, like Schleswig-Holstein belonged to Denmark, that entire peninsula. And Ahu was a very, very famous Jewish community. Had a long history, and it was a wealthy place because it was a port. So it had the merchants, and it had an economy. Rabbi Yaakov Emden was a fierce antagonist to the Sabbateans, to the Shabbetai Tzvi people. To the extent that after it happened, he devoted himself to ferret out secret Sabbateans that were hiding, so that they would not have an influence in the Jewish world. He wrote a fascinating autobiography. One of the rare times you find there are a number of Rabbonim who wrote autobiographies that are really revealing and fascinating. The last one of that genre in Eastern Europe was that of Rabbi Elio David Rabinowitz Teumim, the Aderis, the father-in-law of Rav Kook, who wrote his autobiography. You get a completely different picture when you read it. You know, it eliminates all the fantasies that are present in the Jewish world. Maybe that's why the autobiographies rarely are reprinted. They're printed, and then like nobody. This one of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, they print 1,000 copies. It's sold out in a day and a half, and then 50 years pass before they'll reprint it again, because he really has, really human qualities to do it. He writes about the fact that when he was a young boy, he met a certain girl and he fell in love with her, and he wanted to marry her, and his father objected, wouldn't allow the marriage to take place. And because he didn't want to object to didn't want to rebel against his father, so he let it go. But all of his life he pined for her. And eventually, he writes that, eventually she became a widow, and she became a rich widow. And she helped him obtain the rabbinic position in Emden, where he takes the name Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Emden is a German city. And so he writes there about all sorts of occurrences that happened to him in his lifetime. But he was a bitter, bitter foe of anyone that even suspected of being a Sabbatean. It was at this time that the community of Ahu chose as its rabbi Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz, who was also known as Rabbi Yonason Prager because he was originally the Rav in Prague. And he was a great scholar. He wrote the Urim V'Tumim on Choshen Mishpat. He wrote the Kresi Uplesi on Yeridea. He wrote a famous Sefer Yaretz Dvash. He was a very, very well-known, well-respected Talmid Chacham scholar, Gaon. And he was also a Kabbalist. Not only a Kabbalist, he practiced Kabbalah in the sense that if people came to him, he gave them amulets. He would write out a Kabbalistic formula or poem or saying, custom made for every person that came to him, depending what the person needed. And it was a kameya. Now, kameyas are mentioned in the Talmud already. So there were always two views regarding kameyas. One view was that they actually did help, and the other view was that psychologically they help. You believed in them. If you believe in something, then, you know, medicine has shown us many times that if a person believes that he or she is going to get better, they get better. Whereas another person with the same problem who doesn't have that belief doesn't necessarily get better. So the mind is a very, and the mindset is very important in life. That's why Jews are bidden to be optimistic, cheerful, faith, believe in a better tomorrow no matter how dark the day is. Because that's what carries you through. We find, for instance, in Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo says regarding wearing a kameya on Shabbos, carrying it in the street, wearing it around your neck. So he says that even if the kameya doesn't work, but if the people feel that it works, then you can do it, because to that extent it works. So Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz distributed kameyas. He distributed these amulets. Yaakov Emden, when he saw the contents of some of the amulets, claimed that there were Sabbatean overtones to what he had written. And he claimed that he really was a secret Sabbatean. And therefore he mounted a tremendous campaign against him. Now this was a machlokas, a dispute between two great rabbonim that split Europe in half. Every rabbi, so to speak, in Europe was forced to choose sides. First question that his congregation would ask him is, whose side are you on? And whatever answer you gave was the wrong answer, naturally. And if you said that you weren't on anyone's side, then what kind of leader is that? So it was a terrible situation, terrible situation. Most of the rabbis in Europe backed Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz, who denied all of these accusations. But the damage was done. Till our time, there is debate amongst scholars as to whether or not Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz was really a Sabbatean or not. Gershon Sholem, the professor at Hebrew University who passed away a decade ago, was of the opinion that Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz really was a fellow traveler, at least with the Sabbateans, and that Rabbi Yaakov Emden was correct. Most rabbis and most scholars disagree vehemently with that. and say that he was persecuted needlessly. When Rabbi Yaakov Emden died, he passed away on a Friday in a pouring rain. The Chevra Kadisha wanted to have him buried before Shabbos. When they came to the cemetery, the only grave that was open was near Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz, and that's where they buried him. I've seen records of people who were there before the war, so they're buried like close to each other, and so God gets even always. But it was not only Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz that Rabbi Yaakov Emden took on. He took on anyone that, so to speak, was different, because this was a dangerous time. The damage that was done by Shabbetai Tzvi was so great that anyone that could be suspected of somehow continuing the damage or compounding it had to be eliminated. Which brings us to another different person of the time, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, Ramchal. Now, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, at an early age, he was Italian, as the name indicates. Famous family, the Luzzatto family amongst Italian Jews. And he was a genius. But he was a different person. I don't know how to describe it, but the Jewish world rarely tolerates different people. They have a hard time. You got to fit the box. And people who are outside the box, no matter how great they are, have a difficult time. So he was, when he was 20 years old already, he had rabbinic ordination, he had smicha, he was a big Talmud Chacham, but he was a great Kabbalist. Studied Kabbalah, knew Kabbalah, and he practiced Kabbalah. He had seances, all sorts of things. So the rabbis of his hometown in Italy put him in cherem, they banned him. So he went to another place in Italy, and there his reputation caught up with him, and those rabbis threw him out also. And then from Italy he came to France, and in France he got thrown out, and he ended up in Amsterdam in Holland, not far from Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden suspected him of being a Sabbatean, and also got on his case. In Holland, he was a lens grinder. He was an optician, made glasses. So he was forced to leave Europe. He came to Tiberias, and he lived there only a short time, and he died there in a cholera epidemic when he was about 42. And he's buried outside the cave where Rabbi Akiva is buried in Tiberias, on the mountain in Tveria. Now, he wrote a book called Mesilas Yesharim, Path of the Just, which is a book of ethics and philosophy, but it's also a book of Kabbalah because of the fact that he took the brisa that appears in the Talmud attributed to Reb Pinchas ben Yoyer. Reb Pinchas ben Yoyer had a step-by-step approach how to achieve Ruach HaKodesh, how to achieve holiness, and how to achieve, so to speak, a unity with God. And he took that brisa and explained the step-by-step, each step individually. He also, because he was a different person, he wrote poetry. He wrote plays. And he also wrote philosophic works such as Das Tvunos, Derech Hashem. In his lifetime, none of this registered. After his death, he became one of the prime figures in Jewish thought. The Gaon of Vilna said that the Mesilas Yesharim, in the first 10 chapters of the Mesilas Yesharim, there's not an extra word. And then in the middle of the 1800s, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the founder of the movement of Musar, when we get there we'll talk about it, so they adopted, the Musar movement adopted the Mesilas Yesharim as its primer, as its main work. And it remains a work that is read today in all yeshivas. And it also remains, it's also the gateway to his other works, the Ramchal, the Derech Hashem is studied, the Das Tvunos is studied. So you have many times in life that you have to wait and see how history votes. History has a vote. And many times a person who in one's lifetime does not receive very great recognition will receive it after one's death. And vice versa, there are people who during their lifetime are flooded with honor and accolades, and then 100 years later nobody remembers who they were. So you always have to wait for history to vote. But this is the mood of the time. The mood of the time is depression, to a certain extent persecution of other Jews because of suspicions of their being Sabbateans, and a lot of strife, a lot of internal strife in the Jewish world. Nobody's willing to give anybody the benefit of the doubt. And all of that is because of Shabbetai Tzvi. That's all the natural reaction to that debacle, to that disaster that happened to the Jews. And they couldn't imagine how to deal with it, and therefore it created zealotry on one side, and it created a sense of almost complete yush, of giving up, of having no hope on the other side. What's the use? When you combine this with the fact that Europe itself was going through the throes of the terrible 30 Years' War, it was going through this Protestant Catholic civil war that killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. And you combine it with the fact that the Enlightenment is beginning, and that there are people who now openly speak not only against the church, but against religion generally, and say that religion is, instead of being a positive thing, is a negative thing. It's a destructive thing. So you have this turmoil. And the turmoil will affect the Jews, because the Jews are always, they're part of the society. We are influenced by the society we live in, no matter how we try to seal ourselves hermetically away. But there's no such thing. And therefore this becomes a struggle as to how do we respond to these pressures. How do we respond to the direction of society? What answers do we have? Because apparently the old answers didn't work anymore. And the Jews became, how shall I put it, very wary about Messianism and about the Messiah. There's the old Jewish joke about the man that lived in a small town in Europe, and he was not only unemployed, he was unemployable. He was useless. And so the people in town had to support the man and his family. How are they going to do it? So they tried to give him a job. So he came home one day and he told his wife, he said, you know, Yenta, today I got a terrific job. It's wonderful. She said, what's the job? He said, they told me that I should every morning and all day long go up on the roof of the synagogue and look to the east and see if the Messiah is coming. And if the Messiah is coming, then I should blow the shofar so everybody in town will know that Mashiach is coming. And so she said, well, how much are they paying you for this? So he said, 2 ruble a week. So she said, well, the pay's not much, but the job is steady. So that reflected the, the underlying bitterness that was felt. And even though Jews believed in the Messiah, in the coming of the Messiah, they became very wary of Messianism. So that when the Messiah does come, in Mirz Hashem, speedily and in our days, he'll have to do a big job of convincing. Because, especially if he's not Hungarian, so he'll have difficulties. But that's the inner resistance already. It's the immunity, so to speak, that was built up by these past bitter experiences. And we see a little of that in Israel today. For instance, there are Jews that see the state of Israel as part of a messianic movement, as a forerunner to the Messiah, as being itself a part of the process of redemption. Well, I certainly hope it is, but there are many Jews who are not willing to declare that, because once burned, twice warned. And since we were burned so badly, so we see that even in religious Zionism, for instance, Rabbi Reines, who was one of the founders of religious Zionism, always claimed that religious Zionism had nothing to do with Messianic times. He said Zionism was just a practical answer to a practical problem. Problem of Jewish alienation and persecution and etc. But it was not meant to be Messianic. However, that line could not be maintained forever. And therefore, that's a question that does exist in the Jewish world today. Rav Kook, for instance, saw it as part of a messianic, part of a redemptive time. And that may explain why there are such strong feelings about the state, and why there's a section of Jewry that, even though observant and Torah-centered, refuses to even think about the state, or to consider it as something worthy to be thought about. So that's all a reaction to this problem of the fact that Messianism is a very, very dangerous brew, and it has caused untold harm to the Jewish people over the ages. And therefore, skepticism, restraint, etc., healthy doubt remains the mainstream attitude. And lately, we saw the same thing with Chabad, with the Messianism that came forth from there, right? So rejected by all other streams of Judaism, all other Hasidic groups, all other Talmidei Chachamim, etc., simply because of the fact that you're playing with fire. And we've seen that some of the Messianists go overboard, and then it becomes a distortion of Judaism. Anyway, so this is what the Jewish world looks like at the end of the 17th century, the beginning of the 18th century. Now there's another change that occurs, a very important change. Russia, under the Romanov Tsars, the Romanovs were committed East Russian Orthodox believers. And under the Russian Orthodox Church, Russia is Holy Mother Russia. The ground of Russia is holy. A holy place. And because of that, the policy of the Romanovs was to exclude all infidels, all non-Christians, all non-Russian Orthodox from the country. So you had basically the core of Russia. Ukraine was Roman Catholic, the Baltic states were Roman Catholic, Poland was Roman Catholic. And then you had the Jews. So until the time of Peter the Great, which is the end of the 1600s and the beginning of the 1700s, Russia is pretty much Judenrein. There are no Jews in Russia. The Jews are all outside the borders of Russia. Now, Peter the Great expanded the borders of Russia. He defeated the Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus, pushed Sweden out of continental Europe, and now parts of Poland became Russia, the Baltic states became Russia, parts of the Ukraine became Russia. Later on, parts of the Caucasus would become Russia, where the Muslims were. So that Holy Mother Russia no longer had a population that was Holy Mother Russia. And then there arose the question, what do you do with these people? And that was a problem that plagued the Russian czars throughout the 1700s, throughout the 1800s, till the Russian Revolution in 1917. And the residue of that problem still exists today. And that the Jews are not seen as Russians. So Peter the Great, his imperial ambitions were greater than his religious inhibitions. And therefore, since he wanted the territory and he wanted to control all of that landmass, so he had to accept non-Russian Orthodox believers into Russian society, all of which became a problem and to a certain extent remains a problem today. When the Soviet Union broke up, all these little places made their own state. Kazakhstan, Turkestan, all of the Azerbaijan, Armenia, all of these places, because they're not Holy Mother Russia, and they don't want to be. So that today, pretty much Russia is back to the borders that it was before Peter the Great, with a few major exceptions. It's still much farther west than it was before Peter the Great came. Now, Peter the Great built the city of St. Petersburg, which he named after St. Peter, but everybody says he really meant it for himself. And it was a marvelous achievement because it's built on a swamp, on tidal land. The tide comes in and out every day. So you've got these enormous structures that are built on a tidal basin, and the foundations, therefore, have to be able to move with the coming of the tide, or the going out of the tide, without the building moving. And we're talking here early 1700s. That's a pretty impressive feat. Of course, at least 30,000 people died building the city. But in the time-honored fashion of the Russian dictators, the autocrats, there always were 30,000 others that they could get. So it made no difference. Stalin built the canal from the White Sea to the Arctic Ocean by forced labor. The people built it by hand. They had no tools in the frost of the Russian winter. So tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands of people died. So what? Meanwhile, they had the canal. Of course, the canal is useless. It doesn't work, and it has no economic benefit, etc. But it was the centerpiece of his mania to show how socialism could produce great things. Why doesn't it work? Because it takes maintenance to keep a canal going, and the dirt and the sand and the everything else rises, and there's nobody to take care of it. And because of the fact there's not many people who want to go from the Arctic Ocean to the White Sea. I mean, it's not Florida in February, right? So, but Stalin really imitated Peter the Great, because Peter the Great was willing, he set the example. So you go to St. Petersburg today, you see this. The city is very dilapidated because in the 75 years of communism, they never took care of anything. But it still is. Someone phrased it very well. It's a beautiful woman in shabby clothing. It's a beautiful city. City of canals and parks and tremendous plazas. It's a beautiful, beautiful city. But it's very ill-maintained. And it suffered greatly in the Second World War when it was besieged by the Germans for 900 days. And held out, and then again, probably 1 million people died in the siege. So all of this affects the Jews one way or another. So the Jews now in Europe are faced with a complete change of the infrastructure that they were accustomed to. And one more point is the fact that in Germany, the Enlightenment took hold. Germany, ironic thing about Germany is that it was the most civilized country in Europe. It was the most enlightened country in Europe. It was the first country in Europe that gave Jews really any sort of civil rights, equal rights, citizenship, admittance to university. And it turned out to be the worst country in Europe. So, it's hard to figure. It's hard to say why. There's a book by Daniel Goldhagen called Hitler's Willing Executioners, which is a book about why the Germans did it. Why the Germans were the main perpetrators of the Holocaust. And he advances theories as to why it was. But I think that whatever answer we'll never have an answer. It's just one of those mysteries that no one can deal with. Why Germany should have been the seat of, been the place where Hitler could come to power. Why couldn't he have come to power in France or in England or other places in Europe where situations were similar, comparable, problems were the same? Not known. So there are three main responses to this problem of the Jews in the Jewish world in the 18th century, and we'll discuss each one of them individually because they each have their own completely different direction. One response is the rise of the Reform movement in Germany. Reform, which in effect changed Judaism, redefined Judaism, and in effect said that we give up on the land of Israel and we give up on all messianic hopes, etc. None of that, forget that. And we're going to somehow integrate ourselves into European society, and if necessary, then we're even willing to countenance intermarriage, conversions, everything that will make us acceptable in European society. The Reform, in fact, saw itself as the bulwark against conversions, because you could be a Reformed Jew and still be Jewish, You didn't have to convert, but you could have all the benefits of, so to speak, having converted. But that didn't work because in the non-Jewish world that didn't want to accept Jews, so they didn't want to accept Reformed Jews either. But Reform was one response, definite response to the problem. Second response was the Hasidic movement, which took place in Eastern Europe. Reform movement took place in Western Europe. The rise of the Hasidic movement. And the Hasidic movement created a world all unto itself, almost excluding the outside world completely. And it created this great inner spiritual world where, so to speak, you really lived, or Jews really lived, and the outside world was just something to be born, something to be suffered, but that it really had no relationship to you. Now we'll see also that the Hasidic movement was not universally accepted. Great divisions within the Jewish world regarding it, and there were great divisions within the Hasidic world itself. The Hasidic world was never monolithic, always was fragmented. And in fact, the opponents of the Hasidic movement, the Misnagdim, always used to say ruefully that the difference between a Misnagin and a Chassid is only one Rebbe. And so that was another response. That was a mass response that encompassed millions. And then the third response was the Haskalah, the Enlightenment itself amongst Jews, which bred Jewish nationalism, which in turn bred Zionism, as a response to the Jewish problem and how the Jewish problem could be dealt with. All of these responses took place in the 19th century, and they were all very powerful movements, swept many people along with them, and then history will have to assess, after the passage of time, what happened and how beneficial, if at all, it was, and to see which survived in their original form and which really provided an answer. All of this is naturally colored by the fact that the Holocaust occurred. European Jewry, to a great extent, was wiped out. That was something that no one imagined. That was, no one had a program for that. And so therefore we're going to look at it with perfect hindsight, having known that that's what happened. But the people who were involved in the 18th, 19th, and even 20th centuries, even till the 1940s, had no sense that such a thing was going to happen, could happen, would happen. And therefore, all of this has to be seen through that looking glass, so to speak. You can't look at it and say, well, look, didn't they see that, the Germans were going to destroy them? Didn't they see, how the anti-Semitism was going to eventually eradicate them? Why didn't they all pick up and leave? All of those questions are all asked in perfect hindsight. And hindsight is cheap. Our grandchildren will turn around 80 years from now and say, well, how could they have been so stupid? But we don't think we're so stupid. We think we're doing the best that we can.